Hi, Nancy.
Welcome to episode 56 of the Front Porch Book Club.
The Front Porch Book Club is a podcast that meets twice a month.
We like to dig deep into the relationship between characters and the worlds they live in.
Grab your book and iced tea and join us on the Front Porch.
I'm so excited. Today, we're interviewing Dr. Margaret Jacobs, based on our reading of Our Missing Hearts by Celeste Ng. In Our Missing Hearts, children are taken from their parents who don't espouse the approved ideology. But a Choctaw grandmother reminds us this is not unprecedented. The U.S. government has systematically separated families in the past based on race, legal status, and other reasons. One policy the Choctaw grandmother refers to is Native American children being taken from their families and sent to distant boarding schools. We were interested in learning more about some of these actual policies, and we were thrilled to have Dr. Jacobs join us. For the last 20 years, she has studied Indigenous child removal. It was a great interview, and she said we can call her Margaret, so that's what we call her during the interview.
This interview is a fascinating look at separation policies in the United States and Australia and Canada. Dr. Jacobs is a professor of history and director of the Center for Great Plains Studies at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. She is a prize-winning author and scholar. Her most recent book is After 100 Winters in Search of Reconciliation on America's Stolen Lands. And it was published by Princeton University Press.
Great. Let's welcome Margaret. Welcome, Margaret, to the Front Porch.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're so thrilled to have you join us today. We're intrigued by your research that centers on government policies separating Indigenous children from their families. Can you tell us how you got interested in the topic?
Yeah, I had been working as a historian. I was very interested on my first major project, and my first book was about relationships between white women and Native American women. And I had an opportunity to travel to Australia in 1998. And when I got there, I was doing some research. I wanted to learn more about kind of comparatively what was happening there historically with white women and Aboriginal people. And when I got there, they had just wrapped up an inquiry into what they call the stolen generations, which were Aboriginal children who were removed from their families and either put in institutions or put up for adoption. And that was a policy that existed for at least 100 years and resulted in over a third of all Aboriginal children being taken from their families. Oh. And so when I got there, I just was immediately appalled. I mean, I was the mother of two young children, and I started to think about what that would mean in my own life if the government could just take my children without any cause and just I would never see them again, or I might, only see them again after 10 or 20 years or something. So I was really appalled by that policy. And then I started asking questions when I was going as a historian into the archives. And my questions were, I wonder if white women in Australia were involved in these policies. And my initial assumption was, well, I'm sure they were aware of it, and I'm sure they opposed it. And I found very quickly that that was not the case. They were involved, but they promoted it. They advocated for it. They often carried it out. And they were some of the biggest proponents of it. So the next question that came to my mind, you can see it was just building and building and building. My next question was, wow, I wonder if the United States has stolen generations. And I wonder what white women in the US were doing. And I already knew about the boarding schools, but I hadn't really thought about them in that context. I hadn't thought about them as, boy, are they forcibly removing children to these schools? I knew there was some kind of force involved, but I didn't know the extent of it. So I decided to start researching that. And then again, just as in Australia, I found one, the U.S. is engaged in these policies, and very similarly, the U.S. has similar policies They were removing children to Indian boarding schools. And then after World War II, it became quite common for them to remove children and put them up for adoption. And then the next question I had about white women, it turned out that they were also really involved in the policy, even more so than in Australia. There was even a woman named Estelle Real, who was the superintendent of Indian education for 10 years at the turn of the 20th century. And she was the biggest proponent of compulsory education for Native children, not within their own communities, but by removing them entirely from their communities and families and putting them in boarding schools. So that's kind of how I got into it. It's kind of a mixture of just being appalled personally that this could happen to a group of people in mass like this. And then just being intrigued with the historical questions about it and looking comparatively at it. And why were Indigenous people targeted for this?
Mm-hmm. Why were Indigenous people targeted for it?
Well, I think that at the time when these policies became very common in the United States in the late 19th century, and in Australia the same time, Canada the same time, these were all nations that had colonized the land of Indigenous peoples, but that colonization process had never been complete. All Indigenous people in all of those three nations lost huge amounts of land and were confined to smaller and smaller pieces of land. And in Australia, they didn't really have title to any land at all. But there was a sense among policymakers in all three countries that it wasn't possible for these small fledgling Native communities that still remained. There was the idea that they couldn't remain as distinctive communities. They shouldn't be speaking their languages anymore. They shouldn't be practicing their religions. They shouldn't be engaged in hunting off the reservations in particular. They shouldn't be engaged in their normal cultural activities that they'd done for millennia. There was this idea that they needed to be assimilated into the mainstream of American, Australia, and Canadian society. A lot of government officials believe that if Native children stayed within their communities, they would never assimilate. They would never become part of the mainstream of their, what I call settler colonial nations. Mm-hmm. So I think that's was behind these policies in the first place. Sometimes when I give a talk, somebody will say, but this was about education. The US government was trying to extend education to Native children and a better life and more opportunity. But the thing is, Native people were never opposed to education. They often asked for it. They often negotiated for schools within their treaties, but they wanted those schools within their home communities. They didn't want to have to send their children away from home. And so it was never really about education in my mind. It was always about controlling Indigenous populations, trying to mold and shape them to the kind of norms in those societies.
I was curious. We have an influx of people coming to the United States, and I would imagine the same is true of Canada and Australia. It doesn't seem to me that the same expectations were set for other ethnic groups moving in, but there was something different about the Indigenous peoples of this country and the expectations that they should somehow change and assimilate.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because to some extent there was always an expectation that non-English speakers who came to the US should also learn English and assimilate somewhat to American norms. But, a lot of people who are coming here are choosing to come here and they're choosing to relocate. But I really think the big issue around this is about land. These government authorities really wanted Indian people to lose this strong connection they had with their homelands and their lands. And so by removing them from their families and bringing them to school and really promoting them to permanently move away from their communities and families and really take jobs and positions in the kind of settler economy. They hoped that Native people would no longer have that kind of strong connection to the land. And you have to think late 19th century, this is the very time when they've just passed the Homestead Act and in 1862, and they're really promoting the idea that all these immigrants who are coming into the country, all these other non-Native Americans, they're making these lands that they're dispossessing Native people from, they're making them available to these other groups of people. So there's this, I think, a really strong connection between really wanting to fully colonize the nation and taking children from their families and communities and putting them in institutions in an effort to separate them from not only their families and communities, but also their lands. So, and I think that's why they were particularly targeted more than other groups in American society. I really can't think of another American group that was treated in this way. Of course, we've seen, at the US-Mexico border more recently that children have been separated from their families. But looking in historically, I was not able to find another group in which American authorities were systematically taking children away from their families and removing them thousands of miles away from their families and putting them in some sort of institution. Of course, there were other things that other groups in American society have endured that were also really oppressive, but this is a particularly egregious human rights abuse, and it's something that the UN Convention on Genocide actually mentions as a form of genocide, is removing children from one group and placing them with another. So it's a quite serious human rights abuse.
So Linda and I know a little about the Carlisle Indian School since it's just about 30 or 40 minutes from where Linda now lives. Can you tell us more about those policies from 1880 to 1940 that removed Native American children from their parents and sent them to these boarding schools? The Carlisle Indian School maybe being the most infamous?
Yes. Carlisle was founded on a former Army base in 1879 by a man named Richard Henry Pratt, who was serving in the military, and he had been supervising a group of prisoners of war from the Indian Wars.
Wow.
And he had been doing that in Florida, in St. Augustine, Florida. And he became convinced that he could, he put it this way, he could rehabilitate them by cutting their hair, putting them in uniforms, military style uniforms, requiring them to basically follow a military regime where they were marching every day. He also required them to go to a Protestant Christian church, and he required them to learn English. And he believed that in doing this program with them, that he had changed them. And he started to promote the idea that this would be the solution to what people at the time called the Indian problem. That if this could be scaled up and done for all Native American children, that it would be an effective means of assimilating them. And so he convinced the federal government to allow him to use these old Army barracks, this old Army base in Carlisle, for the very first federal Indian boarding school. There had been boarding schools before that various Christian denominations had run, but as far as I know, Carlisle was the first federal school, and it prompted many people who were really concerned with violence against Native people and with treaty breaking, and a lot of really influential people, many of whom had been abolitionists, became big proponents of the Indian boarding schools. They saw it as a humanitarian and benevolent policy and practice toward Native children. And so they started really promoting these. Some of them, opened their own schools, or like there was a group called the Women's National Indian Association, almost entirely white women. And they would raise money and they would like funnel money to particular schools that they supported or efforts that they supported. And so there became like a network of federal boarding schools across the country. Don't quote me on this exactly, but there were probably 24 what we call off-reservation schools that were pretty far from Native communities, and one of them being Carlisle, and one here in Nebraska is called Genoa Indian School. And then there were boarding schools that the authorities actually placed on reservations. That might sound better than taking children hundreds or thousands of miles away from their home communities. But often reservations were pretty large. And so on reservation boarding schools were still pretty far from their families. And they were very strict. They didn't want the children to be visiting their families on the weekends, or sometimes even in the summers. They put up all sorts of barriers to the children going home. And so these schools all kind of followed what Pratt had done with his prisoners of war. They all, when a child arrived, they would cut their hair, they'd make them shed all their clothing, and a lot of times their parents had dressed them in their finest clothing to come to school. So they take their clothing, sometimes they'd burn it.
Oh no.
Yeah, I know. And then they'd put them in these uniforms. The children had to get used to a totally different regime, a totally different life. They had a very regimented life. Again, it was very military style. They had to get up to the sound of a bell going off or a whistle. They had a certain amount of time in which they could get ready, and then they had to go to breakfast, and they had a certain amount of time for breakfast, and then they had to go march, and then they had their classroom work. Their classroom work, though, was really only in the mornings, and the rest of the day they were expected to either take part in kind of a vocational training or to actually do the labor that they were learning how to do. So for girls, they were teaching them to be basically domestic servants. They were teaching them to cook, clean, iron, do laundry, etc. For boys, they were teaching them primarily to engage in kind of farm labor. But sometimes they had, other things like blacksmithing and things like that they were teaching the boys as well. But it ended up really that the children are performing a lot of the labor at the school.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So the girls are doing all the laundry for the schools. They're doing some of the cooking. The boys are doing a lot of the farming at the schools. And then Pratt also started this system that he called the outing program, where he placed students with local families to gain experience and work. This was a big push. There was this kind of idea that Indigenous people didn't have a, quote, work ethic, and that they needed to learn how to work hard. And interestingly, that outing program, the children were paid, but 2/3 of their wages were taken by the boarding schools and put into trusts, and they only kept 1/3 of their wages. And their wages were much lower than they would have been if they were a non-Native person who was hired to do this. And I especially looked at domestic servants, girls who worked as domestic servants. I found a whole bunch of information about this group of girls who went into service in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I was able to find out how much they were making. Their files were there. And so then I could compare this and I could see, what were other domestic servants making in other places in the country at this time, or even in San Francisco. And they were making about 75% more than these young Native women.
Wow.
So there was actually a high demand for them because people wanted these cheap domestic servants. But again, that kind of gives you a flavor of what the schools were like. Another feature of them was that they became really vectors for epidemics, and a lot of children died at the schools. Uh-huh. For example, at Genoa Indian School, which was open for 50 years, 86 children that we know of died at the school while it was open. And that's why there are many of the Indian boarding schools have cemeteries. Carlisle has a cemetery. Genoa had a cemetery. It has strangely disappeared. And so we're kind of in a situation very much like Canada, where you may be aware that at their residential school sites, they've been finding unmarked graves of children who died at the school and were buried there. And I think we're going to be finding some similar things here in the United States with our boarding schools.
Give us a sense of how old the children were when they might enter the boarding school, and then when they graduated or were dismissed from the boarding school, how old might they have been?
This is a great question, because when the government set up these schools, they kind of had a framework in which they did also build some day schools within communities. And they claimed that the day schools were for very young children, say 5 to 8 or 9. And then they claimed that the on-reservation schools, which would be the kind of next level up, were for children maybe 8, 9, 10, up to maybe 12, 13. And then they claimed that the off-reservation schools were to be for the children, the older children, who, from 12 on up or something. But it didn't work out that way. You had huge numbers of extremely young children going to these really far distant boarding schools. And so, for example, you find reading, documentation where somebody will talk about, here's a child that isn't even out of diapers that's in this boarding school. And and some of the white women who were running these schools were quite appalled at this too, and that they would raise these questions. And that's how we know that this was happening. And sometimes the children were going to school at quite past the age of 18 as well. So that's kind of something else you see on the other end. You see children still going to these schools, still kind of being under the thumb of school authorities well after their 18th birthdays. And a lot of times children didn't actually graduate from the schools. They might have attended for a number of years, found a way to get out of them. I don't know that anybody has actually studied the exact graduation rates for all of the schools or even any of the schools, but I think that's a really ripe area for research, because I think it's just another example of how the schools really didn't have the children's educational needs as a priority. It was a really different priority that they had in mind.
Mm-hmm. What brought the end to these boarding schools?
That's a great question too, because they kind of slowly, in kind of fits and starts, they declined in popularity, but they never really went away until the 1970s.
Oh.
And when the US government passed a kind of raft of what we call self-determination legislation, and in the 70s, they passed an act that gave Indian communities a lot more authority over the education of their children. So there are actually still Indian boarding schools in operation today, but they're either run by the tribes or they're run by the Bureau of Indian Education, which it's no longer kind of assimilation program. And the schools today tend to teach native languages and culture and history, but there's still a problem. The schools run by the Bureau of Indian Education, just a few years ago, there was a report came out that they're just really substandard facilities in terms, things like asbestos, and just they're just in really bad shape. Mm-hmm. But there were other moments when the schools kind of fell out of favor a little bit. And one of these was the 1930s. There was a new commissioner of Indian Affairs who came into his role, and he had been a longtime critic of assimilation policies. And so he shuttered a lot of the schools when he came into power. He opened more day schools within communities. He gave money so that communities could teach their own languages. He really promoted Native art in particular, and he hired a lot of Native people to teach art in their own schools. So that was a really important moment. World War II was a pivotal moment. After World War II, a lot of government authorities argued that the schools were doing more harm than good. And by that, they didn't necessarily mean, oh, they're hurting these children or we shouldn't be assimilating these children. Their idea was they're not working. They're not assimilating children. We need to come up with a better way to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's when you get this period after World War II when a lot of government authorities start to really promote the idea that rather than sending children to institutions, it'd be a better idea to put them into foster care and put them into a foster family that's a non-Native family. And then they wouldn't have contact with other Native children, or less contact, very little contact, if any. And then they ultimately proposed that it would be great to place these children up for adoption in non-Native families. And they even started a program called the Indian Adoption Project that was in existence for 10 years from 1958 to 1968, with the goal of identifying children who'd been removed from their families and then placing them across state lines in families that were far from their homes. And at the same time, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was working really closely with states and encouraging states to also do a internal, within their states, programs where they were removing children and putting them up for adoption, Native children putting them up for adoption or putting them in foster care among non-Native families in their states. So I don't know that we have a good number. We don't know exactly how many children this affected and how many families, but there was some effort to collect statistics and data in the late 60s and early 70s. And at that time, the estimate was that up to 25 to 35% of all Native children were being removed from their families. Some put in institutions still, and some being put up into foster care or up for adoption.
So whether you're talking about boarding schools or foster care, adoption, we're talking about an abuse of power through the government. And that seems to be a setup for abusive institutions and systems. Have you found that to be true?
What do you mean by abusive institutions?
It seems like the oversight and the amount of power that they had, and that the children maybe didn't have any rights. It seems like a setup for abuse to happen.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up because I hadn't mentioned that yet. And sexual abuse, physical abuse in the institutions was rampant. We haven't talked about it much in this country. In Canada, they've talked about it extensively. And you may know that they've had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission up there for the Indian residential schools. And they also have a system for making reparations to people who attended the boarding schools. And they created a kind of system in which they would give reparations to anyone who could prove that they attended an Indian residential school in Canada. And then they had another pot of money that they had set aside for children who made claims of sexual or physical abuse. And they thought that maybe 10% of all people that went to the residential schools would file a claim in that. Well, 37% did. And I'm sure that's a low number because not everybody wanted to relive that experience because they had to come and talk about it. They had to tell people who did it, what did they do, how often did it happen. I mean, it's a horrendous thing that they had to go through. So we know that happened in the US. There have been many Native people who've come forward and talked about it, but that's a tough thing to talk about. And I really agree with you, Linda. I think that there was always this assumption, this is another thing I haven't really gotten into, but there was always this assumption that Indian communities were worse places for children than non-Native families or these kinds of institutions like the boarding schools. There was always this belief that the children weren't being properly cared for in their families or communities. It was not the case, but they were being cared for differently. Mm-hmm. And so there was very little oversight to the schools. And then there was very little oversight of the foster families and adoptive families who ended up caring for Native children as well. There's a wonderful woman named Sandy Whitehawk who has started a group called the First Nations Repatriation Institute. She herself was an adoptee from Rosebud, Lakota, and she experienced sexual abuse. She's quite open about it. And she talks very openly that there was just this assumption that her white adoptive family was this upstanding family, and nobody did any kind of checks to make sure that she was safe and protected. And she knows very well, because she works with a lot of adoptees and children who were in foster care. She knows that this was a very common experience for Native children. And you can get the impression here that this is something so serious and that it's really had long-term repercussions for Native families and communities to have children removed in this way over many generations, and to feel so powerless about it. Like the authorities had the ability to do this, and there was so little recourse for Native families. Many tried to get their children back. Sometimes they even went to court, but that was rare because they lacked the money to pay for this. There was a point in our history when Native people weren't even allowed to testify in court. As a parent myself, I just think, gosh, how horrific that would be to feel so powerless that your children could be removed in this way and you couldn't get them back and you didn't know if they were safe. You didn't know if you'd ever see them again. It's just really appalling.
Truly. You talked a little bit about the reconciliation work that's going on in Canada. Now, you've been involved in Reconciliation Rising, a multimedia project that showcases Indigenous and non-indigenous people who are creating pathways to reconciliation. Can you tell us more about that project?
Yeah. So about 5 years ago, as a historian, I decided that, I'd spent a lot of time, at least 2 decades of my life, exposing these kinds of abuses. And then I thought to myself, what could I do to actually try to repair some of these abuses? And I was really inspired by the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's what led me to want to approach this work in this way. And I thought to myself, well, what skills do I have as a historian that I could make available to support both truth and reconciliation in the country, in the US, about Indigenous child removal? So one of the things I did was start this Reconciliation Rising multimedia project with a local journalist named Kevin Aberusk, who's a journalist here in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he's of Rosebud Lakota descent. And we just work really closely. We wanted to cover people who are working at kind of a grassroots level to address what happened historically and then to try to find ways to heal from it. And so we cover lots of different folks. We have a podcast like you all do. We've made a couple films. We have a website, place where people can go and find out about what other people are doing in this area. And so some of what we have covered in that podcast is about the boarding schools. We've interviewed quite a few people about those experiences and what they're doing. And one of the people we interviewed was a woman named Nancy Carlson, who is from Genoa, Nebraska. I don't know if she's a lifelong resident or not, but she's lived there a very long time. And she and other townspeople there, non-native townspeople, started a foundation called the Genoa Foundation to preserve the history of the Genoa Indian School. So we've interviewed her about that, how that effort has changed over time as they've learned more and more about the abuses that happened in the schools. So that's one thing that we've been doing. We also started a Genoa Indian School digital reconciliation project. that's really very much like, okay, what can I do as a historian? I can try to find these records. I can make them available online so that families of children who attended Genoa Indian School can find more about their ancestors who were at the school. So that's another thing that we've been involved in. I continue to think about what are the things I could do to not just cover these histories, expose these histories, but also help us repair what happened and help other non-Native people like myself to become accountable for what occurred and to think about ways that we can partner with Native people today to support them in their efforts to revitalize their languages, gain back land, anything I can do really to support their aspirations and their priorities.
Can you tell us the website for the Reconciliation Rising project and also the name of the podcast for our listeners? And I'll add links to our show notes as well.
Okay. Yeah, our website is just reconciliationrising.org. And on that website, there's a tab for our podcast. And I think we have 12 to 15 episodes that we've done. We are not like, we don't do one every week or every month. We just do them as they get done. Mm-hmm. But I do feel like we've covered a lot of really interesting folks there. We've covered, for example, several non-Native people who've returned land to Native nations. We have covered a really interesting project with the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. They regained about 400 acres of land and they're creating a tribal national park with it. We've covered a Pawnee woman who works with a non-Native woman in Nebraska, and they've created the Pawnee Seed Preservation Society that plants Pawnee varieties of corn up in Nebraska, which is their homeland.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, so it's been really fun to learn about all these efforts, these grassroots efforts. And in places like Nebraska, like I have found it really empowering and inspiring because it means that we don't have to wait. We don't have to say, oh, nothing's happening in the US. We don't have to say, nothing ever will happen here. If there's nothing going on at the national level, we don't have to despair. We can do things in our local communities and we can forge partnerships with Native people in our communities and in our states and our regions. And I think in many ways that's very meaningful because sometimes these abuses happened at this local level and they happened between our ancestors and the ancestors of Native people. And so if we can rebuild these relationships locally, I think it can be quite a powerful gesture.
That's beautiful.
That is wonderful what you're doing, and it gives hope to, a troubled past that we've had. So I love that. You've written 4 books about the topics. Your most recent one is After 100 Winters in Search of Reconciliation on America's Stolen Lands. In the book, you remind us that the United States was built on the violent dispossession of Indigenous people and discuss what sort of reconciliation is possible. So is this about the work that you're doing now?
It is. That book is almost entirely based on the interviews that Kevin Aberesk and I have done through Reconciliation Rising. That book started out being about trying to compare what was going on in the U.S. in terms of with Canada and Australia around Indigenous child removal, because Australia did the Stolen Generations Inquiry and Canada did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But the more interviews Kevin and I did, the more I realized we can't really compare what's going on in the US. It's not the same, but there is something going on here, but it's more at that grassroots level than it is at a national level. Another insight that I gained from researching and writing that book and doing our Reconciliation Rising work is that I think the most effective way to do this work is to really realize what was at the foundation of the relationships between Native people and settlers. And what's at the foundation is land. And land dispossession is kind of the founding crime, as I put it in the book. And so the most effective, meaningful forms of reconciliation are ones that are going to be about land, returning land, making land accessible to Native nations for their use, finding ways to reconnect Native people to their homelands, and promoting reconciliation on the land, rather than this very disembodied reconciliation up here, rather thinking about let's reconnect people to the places that were so sacred and holy to them.
It's fabulous. How can people best stay in touch with what you're up to? Tell us about your personal website, social media that you're involved in, any other ways that people can stay connected.
Probably the best thing to do is to follow our Reconciliation Rising work. We are on social media. We're also, of course, have our website. Another hat I wear is I'm the director of the Center for Great Plains Studies at the University of Nebraska. We are also doing a lot of work in the space of truth and reconciliation, and we have a lot of resources on our website. So if you Google Center for Great Plains Studies, you'll find us, and you'll be able to find all sorts of resources on our website. We did a whole series in 2022 called Reckoning and Reconciliation on the Great Plains, and we recorded most of that. So if you want a crash course in this and you're really interested in this, we probably have 12 to 15 hours worth of amazing material on that on our website. So I'd really encourage people to check that out.
Fabulous. I'll go ahead and put those links in.
Well, this has been an interesting time talking to you and listening about the work that you're doing to help with reconciliation, and also the historical information that you shared with us on what happened and where things are at now. So thanks very much for joining us and filling us in, and for all your good work you're doing now.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me, and it's been a real pleasure to talk with you both.
Thanks so much, Margaret. It's just been delightful.
Well, Nancy, I'm glad we ended in a spirit of hope and
Yes.
reconciliation.
Yes.
Because this is hard to talk about, and it's hard with the past that we've had, and you do feel bad. And it's wonderful that there's organizations and people that are out there looking at this issue and making recommendations and looking at ways to reconcile with our past. And the same is similar here in Carlisle. They're sort of on that same bandwagon of trying to figure out and make amends and work towards reconciliation.
I really admire scholars like Margaret, because what you need is historians to help us look at our past in an unflinching manner. Let's look at the statistics. Let's look at the data. Let's look at the records. Let's examine the context. And when you have that kind of information, then it becomes clear that wrong was done, and we need to figure out how to heal some of those wounds. Boy, the work that was done in South Africa around truth and reconciliation now is inspiring this work. It is inspiring to see. And I'm so proud that the Center for Great Plains Studies at the University of Nebraska has been involved with this, that Margaret Jacobs, one of our really esteemed historians, is leading the way. And of course, the work that many others are doing.
This is a perfect book because it really segues very well into our book next month, which is I Am a Man, and it's Chief Standing Bear's Journey for Justice. And it's written by Jo Starita, and she does know him. And I began to read the book, and I'm almost done, Nance.
Wow.
I had to kind of stop from saying some things to her that I learned about Chief Standing Bear and his journey and the people that his tribe. So it'll be a great jump off point for next month's book.
Yeah, definitely. The one thing that Margaret mentioned was, some of the generational impacts of these policies, and you can really see this in the story of Chief Standing Bear. And now knowing the history of some of these boarding schools and the separation of Indigenous children from their families, I think for me, it suggests some of the complexity of the relationship that we have as white Americans with the Indigenous population still, that they've had these generations of mistreatment by our government, and there are still ways that they are being exploited, and the impacts of that on their lives, their families, their tribes.
Yeah.
I'm very excited to continue with this Native American theme for another month. In I Am a Man, Joe Starita tells the true story of Chief Standing Bear, who in 1877, along with his tribe, was forcibly removed from their Nebraska homeland. He returns to Nebraska to bury his only son and is arrested. And this book explores fundamental questions of citizenship, constitutional protection, cultural identity, and the nature of democracy. As you mentioned, Joe Starita will join us for our second episode in July to tell us more about this book and Chief Standing Bear.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, Nance.
Me too.
Well, thanks for listening to our podcast. Our website is fromporchbookclub.com.
And our episodes come out twice a month on the first and third Wednesday of every month.
We'll see you next time, Nance.
Yes, absolutely. I can't wait to talk to you about this book.
I know. It's very good. Okay, bye-bye.
I can't say similarly. I have to figure out a way to say that.